Well, for this sermon called The Transcendental in Each of Us, or The Transcendental in All of Us, I've been thinking about transcendentalism for weeks now, and I find myself more and more focused on the word itself. How do we transcend our limitations, it says to me? How do we transcend our fears, our challenges, such as the coronavirus? Transcendence has always felt mysterious, like being lofted into a vicarious or even a visceral sense of rising above, maybe to safety or to new insight. And it can also suggest something tremendously hopeful, as when we escape evil forces. Starting in the 1830s in the Northeast of America, 35 years before the Civil War, a group of intellectuals fostered a craze almost of thinking about transcendentalism. Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson were both fascinated by this subject, caught up in it, sort of like a meditation. Well, we could be too. When I think how I'd like to escape the gloom and morbid fear of the current pandemic and enter into an attitude more wholesome, I want to transcend our despair. And as we were reminded in the little book we saw by D.B. Johnson, Henry Builds a Cabin, there is a joy even in imagining a simple house to protect oneself, transcending fear, transcending the rain. Well, once one begins to really visualize the word, the operation of transcending, maybe transcending a current malady or a disappointment, the idea begins to seem positively positive. It reminds me of the song by Monty Python, always look on the bright side of life. We can grow and transcend and ascend into greater joy, liberty, and peace. But looking at the historical meaning in the book by Philip Gura called American Transcendentalism, if you'd like to know, this is it. Kevin was very nice to loan me a couple of tomes on transcendentalism, and I found myself really very inspired by this. In that book, Philip Gura the book is called American Transcendentalism. He writes, beginning in the 1830s, there were points of convergence or intersection when certain thinkers recognized common interests. Herman Melville even talked about the shock of recognition as when other supporters came to use the term transcendentalism in full confidence that it had a real and important meaning, even if people might have had a hard time saying what that meaning exactly was. Well, in 1842, the meaning came into clearer focus, partly as Unitarians like Emerson and Thoreau and Margaret Fuller, who published at that time hip Dial magazine, were talking about the impact on this idea of transcendentalism on new thought. And another Unitarian minister, George Ripley, even left his Boston Unitarian Church to establish Brook Farm, a famous utopian experiment in community living. And Horace Greeley in the New York Tribune newspaper was writing about it. But what was the fascination with this new subject, transcendentalism? Philip Gura describes the idea this way in his book, American Transcendentalism. Innately present in each individual is a spiritual principle that of itself, without any external stimuli, allows one to distinguish between right and wrong, good and bad, God and Satan, and this supersedes any outward laws or injunctions. And in other words, a religious and moral feeling is naturally present in a human mind, in a human heart. There is something called it like a universal religious sentiment. And every man is a transcendentalist, said another writer. What I think this means is that on one hand, we can trust our intuition and instinct to have positive, life-giving, and supportive effects on ourselves and on our environment. So natural competition for food and other resources will always create some friction, we know that. But generally, what I feel from Emerson's words is that our own life spirit is ready to contribute to the well-being of all. And that's a very broad and possibly over-positive statement of what Emerson was all about. But still, we should not fail to notice, I think, the alliance, the synergy between Emerson's iconic essay of self-reliance and the meaning and import of his thoughts on transcendentalism. We are able to imagine a better future, able to construct pathways and survival mechanisms to get there. And we can confirm our moral commitment to the ideas of industry and self-reliance, as well as building self-reliant communities that model the can-do spirit of American immigrants and pioneers. These immigrants transcended their lives in Europe, Asia, and America and crossed the threshold to new life in the promised land. And transcendence and transcendentalism, in a way, is the modus operandi of life itself. The egg transcends its shell and its hidden growth inside to move into a wild life in the open air. Life is on a quest of transcendence. The word offers new insight into the mechanics of life. Nothing we didn't know before, but still transcending mother's womb is what we do. Breaking free and then growing independently is a form of life transcendence. Transcendentalism, it seems to me, even wants to be a philosophy of the energy of life, the urge to move up. And even in our gloriously conscious minds, we have aha moments, one of my favorite topics, when we transcend ignorance. So what are we to think of transcendentalism today? Is there value or utility or advantage for us in revisiting a term that faded out of use before the Civil War? Perhaps the very idea of transcendence and transcendentalism was swept away in the horror of the Civil War, and then again with World War I. What power could transcendence have in the face of such horrors at that time? But I think there is value for us today as we live with a pandemic and experience threats from the micro dimension, an invisible enemy with almost diabolical powers in this coronavirus. A fear I have is that the corona-19 virus may even transcend its current, somewhat limited pathways of infections and morph or migrate into a more lethal version. The end of humanity, one day it could happen. We're reading the book Station 11 in the future, which deals with a pandemic, if you're curious what that book is about. Right now, our transcendence is making a new and safer pathway. We're washing our hands, carefully maintaining social distance, and watching out. We are already transcending our vulnerable state into a more informed and protected state from this danger. And I think there is some comfort in that and some sense of our wisdom as a conscious group of people on this planet. In a way, transcendence is a form of evolution, one inflected, I feel, with a positive intention to move from one plane to another, safer, more sustainable existence based on the best information, creativity, and planning we can muster. Our brains have a certain role to play. Our intelligence is the basis of our societal transcendence. We can think, live long, and prosper, as Spock might say. Our society is constantly on a self-improvement track. I hope so. I believe so. And this is a skill that any of us can imagine using, learning new skills at rising up from setbacks, growing past injury and disease, poverty and crime, moving toward the good, the right, the moral, the divine even. That is what Emerson was telling us, that we have a natural motor built into our psychic engineering that seeks, by and large, the good. To me, that idea is hopeful and compelling, and it's motivating. There is an upward bound instinct in ourselves, our spirits, our hopes and our plans that ultimately bodes well for all humanity. We do instinctively head for the bright side of life. That's called transcendentalism. I encourage your reflection upon that and thinking about how you will transcend difficulties, probably problems, how you will transcend your current state to live dreams that may be in your mind. So with that thought, I am pleased, proud to share with you thoughts on transcendentalism. And I thank Kevin for leading us into this area of thought as well. Tell him, thank you, Kevin, for helping us transcend